I started working as a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, at the Bouverie Clinic in January '65. For the first about 5 years, till about 1970, I saw almost exclusively children. Did individual and group psychotherapy, play therapy with the children. In 1970, the whole clinic changed to do family therapy, and I, with them, became a family therapist. And I continued to work at the Bouverie Clinic till '79, with one exception, which was that in '75, I went to Israel for a year, and I worked there as a family therapist in a clinic called Ramat Chen, which was part of Kupat Cholim. It may be relevant at this point to stop and say this. Whilst for that year in Israel, I met quite a number of prominent people who have worked with survivors, including the head of the clinic was a man by the name of Franz Brill. And Brill was really the father of psychiatry and psychotherapy in Israel. And he did a lot of work with survivors. And he influenced me in providing me the term and the concept that he argued that to work with survivors, you need to be a mental health GP to the family, that you be available to them at all time, whether to see them regularly, weekly, or from time to time, and see the whole family, parts of the family, in any combination that seems appropriate, as it were. In 1979, I moved to private and started working here from this room since 1979. I've worked in Williams Road until today. But since 1970 until today, I've been working as a family therapist. And last week you asked me when did I first discover the Holocaust, and I told you, as far as I know, I've always known about the Holocaust. And I don't know when I started working with survivors and their families. Why? Probably one, that at the Bouverie Clinic, we had a large number of Jewish families, even though it was the other side of town. It was in Carlton. Probably working with the children themselves and not their parents, the Holocaust was there in the background, but it wasn't accessible to me in the sense that I could have a conversation with the parents, because I would see the child and the psychiatrist or the social workers would work with the parents. So probably I attributed more significance to some of the things that they wrote or didn't write, but it wasn't part of my conversation. When we started working with families, I guess the Holocaust came into the conversation. But to me, when I talk to any Jew, the conversation, where were you during the war, is the most natural part of a conversation. So I'm not even aware that I'm doing it. But over the years, I have worked with numerous number of survivors and their families. And what I should say about it is the following. One, that I guesstimate that about a third, sometimes half, of the people who have seen me over the years have been Jewish, and the majority of Jewish people in Melbourne have been affected by the Holocaust one way or another. So it always was part of the background, and every so often that it became the foreground, the subject of conversation, if you wish. Now, it's important to say, I guess, that no individual or family have ever come to see me primarily because of the Holocaust. People came to see me because somebody in the family was depressed, anxious, scared, family conflicts, disharmony, violence, a whole range of physical difficulties, like whether it was high blood pressure or, in one case, stiff neck that I wrote about, and so on and so forth, anorexia. Now, what happened was that I just worked with survivors, and I better check on the date here. That's right. In 88, or just before that, I received a letter from an Israeli psychologist, Israel Chani, who said he wrote a lot about the Holocaust and genocide. He was particularly interested in genocide. And he wrote that he's coming to Australia. Would I be able or willing to organize for him some presentations here? Unbeknown to him, he also wrote to my then professional partner, Brian, and he didn't know that we share premises and we are in partnership. And we talked to each other, and we decided that we would write back to him and say that we would be very happy to host him on the condition that what we do is we organize a conference about working with Holocaust survivors and their families. And he agreed, and we did it in 1988, I think. And as far as I know, that was the first time that mental health professionals got together to talk about working with survivors. I know that many were working before, but it wasn't formally presented and shared. And what's interesting about this is that in a year later, we wrote the proceeding of that conference and published it in the Australian New Zealand Journal of Family Therapy. That was in '89. And after that, I started presenting from time to time. And Mark Baker, who at that stage was the editor of Generation, kept chasing me and say, why don't I write for Generation about the subject? And it took me quite a number of years before I actually did. So I published an article about my work with survivors in Generation in 1994. So,
interesting. Can I just...
Yeah, sure.
Because what you're doing there in your work, it starts all around. The world is again, not awakening, but looking at Holocaust survivors and their families in very different ways. Because 94 already is Spielberg's Schindler's List, and then what follows after it. But there became the silence, which you were breaking already, became much more open.
Yeah, that's
so there were parallel stuff that you led into somehow.
Yeah, Yeah, I wasn't a Robinson Crusoe, and I wasn't.
You were doing pretty cutting edge work.
Yes, yes. And look, it's interesting to think how much what I did came out of my conversation with the people I worked with, how much it's to do with my background, and how much it was the influence of the world at large.
And
as it were.
you as a therapist.
Yeah.
And your amazing role that you would listen and not judge and allow them to speak and not be frightened about it.
Mm-hmm.
That all has to play.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But coming back for a minute, what is interesting to me when I noticed just in the last few days, presenting at the conference we organized here in '88 until publishing for the first time in '94, why did it take me so long? I never realized that there was such a long gap. And that is what I want to share with you now. First, I want to again acknowledge that I'm very grateful to Mark for being such a persistent bugger, if I'm allowed to use, and encouraging me to write. But and what I did, what happened was that I remember really struggling with the issue of writing or not writing. And the inhibition against writing was very, very powerful. I want to talk about that first. I think in the first place, I felt very strongly a sense of inadequacy. I sort of felt, who am I to write about it? Two, I thought that I haven't got the language, that what I heard and experienced and what I sense the people who talk to me experience cannot be properly conveyed in language. And I was terrified of writing in a way that is going to trivialize what I thought people shared with me. And I cannot emphasize it strongly enough. It was a huge, huge struggle for me. There was another fear, and that is that I didn't want to join the industry that disparagingly some of my Israeli friends refer to as Shoah biz. And until today, it's one of my great fear that I don't want to be part of it. There is a way that you can use your own or other people's suffering for self-promotion, to aggrandizement or advantage. So it was a very big, big struggle for me. And then there is the other side. And the other side is, if I don't write and people don't write, then we remain silent, and that's no good either for obvious reason. So eventually I agreed to write, and I wrote just the one article, but Mark and myself agreed to open it up for a symposium. So we invited a reasonably large number of other prominently placed people, both Australian, one Israeli therapist, and two American, to join in and respond to what I wrote and contribute their own thoughts. So the whole issue was about, if I recall correctly, about working with survivors.